Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Pocklington, if we start with the announcement from a couple of weeks ago about the winter funding of further £10 million, do you consider that that is going to be sufficient to deal with this problem during these cold winter months?
Thank you, Mr. Wild. Our assessment is, yes, we have got adequate funding at the moment, though of course we keep the situation under review. The 10 million you refer to is from our Protect Plus programme, but that is of course in addition to everything that we have done this year. The work of Everyone In hasn't stopped throughout the year. 33,000 people are currently being supported, and I'd also like to put on record my thanks to all the outreach workers, coordinators and managers working in councils and charities and in the accommodation sector for all their work that has made that such a success during the past year. What the £10 million is doing, in addition to the money that has already been provided this year, is providing additional targeted support as we are asking councils to redouble their efforts to accommodate all those sleeping rough during this particularly acute phase of the crisis. We're asking them to reach out again to those that have so far refused accommodation or people that have, for whatever reason, returned to the street. It's a call to arms to have a further go to support them and also to ensure they're registered with a GP as the vaccination programme begins.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I want to come on to the vaccination programme shortly. In talking to one of the organisations, the Purfleet Trust in Kings Lynn, who've done great work along with the local authority and Broadland Housing and others, they made the point to me that getting people into accommodation is obviously very important, but it's actually the real challenge is in keeping them there. So is there enough focus and funding for the wraparound support and the skills development that these often vulnerable people need?
Thank you. I think the importance of providing appropriate wraparound support has been at the heart of our approach during the past year. The vast bulk of our funding is actually RDEL resource spending rather than capital spending, and a big reason for that is to enable appropriate support to be spent. That's something that we learnt during the Everyone In phase, where we worked with charities, with Baroness Casey, in order to ensure that appropriate support staff and security was provided. We know that from our own evidence, from the department's own evidence, through our rough sleeping questionnaire, that the significant majority, about 80% of rough sleepers, have mental health needs, a significant majority have substance abuse needs, and it's important we provide that support in order to provide our best attempt, our best shot at transforming lives and putting people onto a sustainable pathway out of rough sleeping.
Thank you. I don't know if Baroness Casey, if you wanted to add anything on, particularly about the importance of the wraparound support and skills development and that focus.
Well, Mr. Wild, I'd be fair to say that I think in the early months of Everyone In, March onwards, the overriding priority was the public health response to COVID-19 and less concentration on the multiple needs of many people on the streets. And I think my opening gambit, which colleagues in the department are aware of, is that we weren't pretending, I think, at that point, to be doing an all singing, all dancing, rough sleepers strategy. And there were moments during those early months where I looked around and thought, where the hell can we get treatment and alcohol and detox beds from, on the basis they didn't exist to quite the same degree. It's an awfully long time ago, Mr. Wild, but I was the homelessness czar back in 1999 onwards, where actually the obsession with treatment and detox was important. So I was pleased that later on in the year, the department has actually made very clear and actually put funding has been made available for treatment and support. And I think that's incredibly important. I think I'll keep my comments brief, but when you have crises, either severe weather, for example, which is the traditional one, in periods of severe weather, you can get people in, otherwise you can't get in. And actually you need to use those moments to get the treatment to support so that they don't go back out, but they stay in. But even prior to the pandemic, the chain data in London that I think the committee is well aware of, it's in the NAO report that we're discussing today, showed that pre the pandemic, if you look at the number of people that have been out on the streets in London, and that's always slightly different to elsewhere, but it's a good indicator, people who've been out on the streets for more than 2 years was a significant dent. It's a significant issue. And 90% of those people, and it's 86%, have drug, alcohol and mental health problems. That's backed up by Jeremy, what you just said a moment ago, Jeremy, about the qualitative work that was done on 500 rough sleepers just at the tail end of last year, that yet again, Mr. Wild showed incredibly clearly just how ill, really, in other ways, such as drug, alcohol, mental health, those people are. So yes, it's the right question, and it's a vital response that will be needed in the longer term.
Mr. Wild.
Thank you. Mr. Pockley, just in terms of the funding, clearly the voluntary sector is at the heart of a lot of the response here. Do you think you've got the balance right in terms of funding that they can apply for directly, as opposed to much of it is filtered through local authorities, which then creates more hoops for voluntary sector to then have to bid into local authorities to then provide support services, which we can predict that they will be providing?
Thank you, Mr. Wild. It's a good question. I think what I would say is that the majority of our funding is funded through the local authority route, and I think that is the right approach, given our desire, essentially set out in the rough sleeping strategy, that local authorities should be in the lead in coordinating the response, tailoring it to local areas. But we do provide some funding direct to charities and voluntary groups in order to support them directly. But the bulk of our funding, either directly through the department's money, through the 700 million that we provided, or the councils have themselves provided through their own resources this year, that we have also then funded, as we've discussed with this committee on several previous occasions. The bulk of it does go through councils.
Mr. Wild.
Thank you. I spoke to my borough council this morning to get their views ahead of the session. I mean, one of the key asks that they had was for long-term funding. You've obviously provided a lot of funding this year, but going forward to deliver that manifesto commitment, are you in a position where you are looking to provide longer-term funding, which doesn't also involve continually having to apply for certain grants and to go through all the bureaucracy and processes that's in place for that, and giving a bit more autonomy to councils to tackle this problem working with the voluntary sector?
I think the importance of longer term funding, the ability to use that to build up capacity and capability in the sector throughout the country, is something that's well understood in the department. Now, we've been able to do that to an extent this year through our rough sleepers accommodation programme, the RSAP programme that I'm sure we'll come on to discuss. We have clarity over our funding for next year for the homelessness and rough sleeping agenda. So we'll have £750 million being funded from the department next year, which is higher than this year, actually. But of course, there are aspects of this agenda that will need to wait for the spending review later this year. But in terms of where the department is, we understand the importance of providing longer term certainty where that's possible.
Great, thank you. In terms of numbers, how many people do you estimate are still sleeping rough in England at the moment?
Thank you, Mr. Wild. So our local intelligence is that the numbers sleeping rough at the moment are significantly lower in the last formal sort of snapshot that the department undertook, which was actually now dates from November 2019. That number was 4,266, I think. The numbers are significantly lower than that. The next official number that will be published on the 25th of February. Now, that's an official statistic, so I don't think I can preempt the publication of that number to give you a more precise figure.
Okay, but you said significantly lower, I think was your phrase, which we'll all interpret in our own way. If I can come on to the vaccination element of this funding, what are the targets that you have in terms of vaccinating rough sleepers? How many are you expecting to do, and by when?
Thank you. So vaccination is obviously a very important priority for us right now in the department and in government. Our overall aim, the strategy, is that rough sleepers should receive their vaccination in line with their position in the priority groups as outlined by the Joint Committee on Vaccinations and agreed by government. So rough sleepers should need the support to take their rightful place in the queue as set out by the wider government. And so the deadlines are the same deadlines that the government has for the wider groups. Obviously, many rough sleepers may be clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable, and so will receive their vaccination in the coming weeks. That's why, as part of our Protect Plus programme, we've focused, as well as on housing rough sleepers, also asking councils and others to ensure that they're registered with a GP. Actually, we found from our evidence that quite a high proportion of rough sleepers are registered with a GP. I think in the evaluation that Baroness Casey's also referred to, we think the number is actually about 85%. Not necessarily in the place they are now, though, so not necessarily in the right place. And it's not just about registration, it's going to be about engagement as well, in order to ensure that rough sleepers can receive not just their first, but also their second dose as well. And we're working very closely with Department for Health, the NHS and Public Health England on this work.
So have you modelled how many of the 33,000 people who've been helped through Everyone In will be on the vaccination priority 1 to 9 groups?
I don't have that information at the moment. We're working very closely in real time, as it were, to make sure that we have as good data as we possibly can in the weeks ahead.
Okay, and do you, again, talking to the Purfleet Trust in my area, one of the points they made about this being a success is for the vaccinations to happen in a place where people feel comfortable and with people who they trust, because there's quite a lot of concern and misinformation things around. People are distrusting, obviously, of authority generally. How's that being built into how the vaccination programme is going to support these individuals?
I think that's right. We know that trusted contacts and trusted relationships with support workers is going to be important here, and something that we're working very closely with the NHS on is the fact that for some people who are rough sleeping, it may be that mainstream provision is not the appropriate way for this group to receive the vaccination, and alternative approaches will be necessary so that they receive the vaccination in a setting that they are comfortable with, and that's very much part of our work at the moment.
Part of the challenge is the gap between jabs, particularly for people in these groups. Has there any thought been given to reducing the period back to the 3 weeks to make it more likely that people will return?
That would be a matter for the Department of Health and the NHS. We're working closely with them. We don't have plans to do that at the moment, but we do need to ensure that there are high levels of registration and engagement to ensure that this group are vaccinated.
Okay, thank you. Baroness Casey, you said in your opening answer that this was primarily a public health measure rather than one designed to tackle rough sleeping and give the broader support that people need. Were you given objectives to the programme when you kindly agreed to sort of take on a slightly different role to the one you came into the department to do?
I sat down with Robert Jenner, the Secretary of State, and that afternoon actually with Jeremy, And I think we realised there was one pretty straightforward objective, which was to make sure that people on the streets and people in what I thought at that time was informal communal settings, i.e. some of the tent cities that have grown up around both London and outside, needed to be brought in as quickly as possible. So we had a very singular focus in terms of getting everyone in. May I just jump back to the vaccination issue for a moment, just in case it doesn't come up later? I think there are two things. First of all, to reassure you, Mr. Wild, that on the whole, in my 25-year experience of working with people who are vulnerable, medics and nurses are some of the most trusted people and actually get to the bottom very often of what's going on in people's lives more effectively than those of us that are civilians. And actually the problem has been getting medics and particularly people in uniforms such as paramedics and others. They are very trusted people and trusted by people who are homeless, and sometimes make some of the most effective outreach workers. And my second worry, which I raised with the Select Committee, and I know the Secretary of State in MHCLG and Jeremy are very aware of, is I'm actually terribly worried about the people who are outreach workers and working in some of the most chaotic projects right now, not being seen in terms of that vaccination process as key workers, and being in a very big group of people that will come after and after and after other, quite rightly, important people in the NHS. But I can assure you, running some of these hotels with people who have got extraordinarily high levels of needs is actually presenting a real difficulty when they've also been in those environments for several months. People are banging off the walls. They're not easy to just say, I'll self-isolate. And using volunteers and staff in that scenario is important. But as with last year, our concern to get PPE to those people was incredibly vital. And this year, I would say getting them near the front of the queue once the big priority, the top four, have been dealt with. And I'm worried that they'll get lost in the directors of public health and local authorities and staff that are legitimate but not on the front line in the same kind of way. And I think we just need to make sure that that happens because that actually also has a cost to the public purse, because the amount of money you spend trying to back it all up. So I just wanted, I hope that was okay.
I think we've got that message loud and clear. Mr. Wild.
And yes, your initial question, it was really straightforward. The objective, remember we were days into an announcement that was essentially saying the country had to go into an immediate lockdown. And actually, colleagues in the department and colleagues outside the department in local government and in charities, we just put our shoulders to the wheel and tried to make that programme as big, as quick and as effective as we possibly could. That was the objective.
Great, that's very clear. Mr. Pocklington's, in the report, I think the latest figures at that stage were that 16 homeless people were recorded of having died within 28 days of contracting COVID. Do you have a more up-to-date figure or estimate from the department on that?
I don't have a more up-to-date figure from that ONS data, which records the number of deaths during the first wave. Obviously, every death is a tragedy in the pandemic, but the number is lower than in many other countries. We continue to monitor the situation with Public Health England. I'm sure in due course we'll have other estimates, but that's the latest estimate that we have.
Okay, thank you. And in pulling together your plans and the objective to get everyone in, did you estimate what the position would have been if that action hadn't been taken in terms of the number of infections and the expected predicted deaths?
There is some evidence on this by external academics. I think that was, I think it was in the Lancet, if I'm correct, that suggests that the work of everyone in avoided 266 deaths and 21,092 infections. So made a significant impact on the impact of the pandemic on this group.
Okay. If I can just come into how your role, Baroness Casey, so you were in the department ready to conduct a review, and then obviously the crisis hit and you volunteered to take on leadership of the response here. Who did you report to? How are you accountable to ministers?
So I've been asked by Downing Street and MHCLG before Christmas, and it was announced in February to do a review. I wasn't actually ready to start that review until actually quite well after Easter. We were still trying to assemble a team, and I was abroad actually doing homelessness work in other countries. So to be honest, I arrived back into the country that weekend before lockdown, and just got in touch with the department and said, is there something I can do to help? And then I went in on that Wednesday because they were having a round table, and proceeded from there. So that's how it all happened.
Okay, in terms of the plan, Mr. Pocklington, this is a bit of a theme that the committee...
Sorry, on accountability, just to be really clear, sorry, the most important part of your question was, I reported as an advisor to the Secretary of State and to Downing Street, but I had a very clear and regular line in with Jeremy Pocklington. On top of that, just to be absolutely clear, that all financial and significant decisions remained within the normal chain of command, from officials to then the junior minister, Luke Hall, and up through him to Robert Jenrick, and then in the normal ways. And I at no point made any financial decisions or took responsibility for those sorts of things. I told people what I thought we should be doing and how we should do it. And I made a very significant push on bringing forward some of the money towards the permanent accommodation. But to be honest, all of that was lifted very, very much by colleagues in the department in the normal way.
Mr. Wilde.
Okay. In terms of the plan, Mr. Pocklington, the theme of some of the evidence we've taken around COVID was that departments didn't have plans for quite a number of the elements of the response, which were then developed at pace, and in the case of this, clearly very successfully in terms of achieving that objective. Why wasn't there such a plan within MHCLG for a scenario on the pandemic?
Thank you, Mr. Wilde. I'm aware that's a theme of the committee. What I would say in this context is local resilience forums actually did have vulnerable people plans that were prepared as part of the influenza pandemic preparedness plan. So they, as part of that, LRFs and local authorities would already be making sure they knew who their vulnerable people were, including rough sleepers, and how they might need to engage with them as part of a pandemic response. But you're right, the department didn't have a sort of central plan in relation to rough sleeping. What was important, though, is that we had built up over a number of years, perhaps rebuilt is a better way of putting it, the capacity and capability in the department, the relationships with the sector that we needed, so that when the pandemic struck, we were able to hit the ground running and move so quickly, as the NAO report says. So, to be more specific, through the Rough Sleeping Initiative, we knew that we were already planning to fund 6,000 beds, 2,500 staff this year in the sector. So we were able to move very quickly, building on those solid foundations.
Okay, thank you. And what are the main lessons that you've drawn for protecting rough sleepers from how the pandemic has been handled?
Thank you. I mean, as Baroness Casey has already said, our objective initially was very much focused on public health and taking rough sleepers and those at risk off the street. And then over time, it moved through the work of the task force to stopping rough sleepers who've been taken off the street going back onto the street as far as we possibly can. So that's been the pattern over the year. I think we've learnt a lot through that process. Getting the investment in the right place really matters. I've talked about the Rough Sleeping Initiative. We'll come on, I'm sure, to talk about the accommodation programme. So the funding, the capacity, and the relationships were the right launchpad. The importance of cross-agency working and partnership working has been absolutely essential with councils, the GLA, with charities, whether that's Crisis, Shelter, St Mungo's, Housing Justice, Homeless Link. We've worked with a whole range of charities in the sector. The accommodation sector, we leveraged relationships with DCMS initially to make sure we had access to hotels like Travelodge or Intercontinental Hotels. IBIS also provided accommodation quickly. Then having the management information meant that we could model the costs, make the case to the Treasury, and then as the pandemic has progressed, invested more and more into this question of wraparound support and the importance of that if we're going to deliver lasting change for the individuals affected. I would also say that simple things matter. We're talking about individuals who have got often with complex needs, and simple things can really help. Providing backpacks and phones made a difference. Having their own space has made a difference as well, and helped transform the lives of many involved. I know Baroness Casey and Penny as well have perhaps seen more the individual cases than I've been able to do, but we really have had many stories of lives that have been transformed through the course of this year.
Thank you. Baroness Casey, the report acknowledges from the views of people who were involved in delivering the response, the impact that you personally had. What difference do you think you did make to the department's approach to this issue?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think that colleagues in the civil service were, hit by the pandemic in a whole raft of ways, and actually DCLG at that moment also had to try and get organised around food out on the shielding to thousands of individuals around the country through local authorities. So it's not like, and I think Jeremy at that point you were the interim permanent secretary. So it was an all in this together moment as much as anything else, really, that we were all in it together. And I think that I've been around a long time, truth be told, and it's not that long ago that I left off running the Troubled Families programme for the very same department, working very much in partnership with local government. So those links I have. Plus, I'm not shy when it comes to ringing up hotel owners and asking them to do various things. So I think I just provide a bit of an extra senior person on the deck, as it were, to try and push this forward. And I didn't really stop. And oddly, being quite independent actually means it doesn't really matter to me who's in charge of a local authority, whether it's Sadiq Khan or Gary Porter in a shire. That my job was to just try and do as much as we could, as quickly as we could, to get this over the line as much as possible. And I think the other thing is that it's not unusual for me to be in direct contact with colleagues in local authorities. So, I sent out an email when I felt things were just a bit too slow, which in retrospect I realised was somewhat churlish of me because it was incredibly fast. And I sent an email out saying, this is all great, but can we get this done by the weekend, please? So I think I just added an extra weight at the right moment in the right time. I'm quite used to government systems and used to the voluntary sector and used to local government. So, other people could have done it. I just had the ability to be there at that point, and I just helped out, really. Okay, thank you. And final question from me, Chair, in this section. Can I ask Baroness Casey why you stood down in the summer and how you would assess the department's handling of the issue since you've stepped down from the role you had? Well, I never went back to be the homelessness czar. I agreed that I would do a review for the government post the election where their manifesto commitment had changed. Obviously, COVID happened and I went in to try and do whatever it is. I felt that we pretty much had the system in place to make sure everybody that needed to be in was in. The sort of doors were still open for people that needed to come in. The system was created, the hotels were open. And then the other one that was important was, I think, and to be fair, Penny and Catherine Bennion in the team deserve a great deal of credit for this, that actually it became really clear that we needed to pull forward the accommodation, the permanent accommodation with support. And I wanted to make sure that that was done, really, just in case anybody ministerially or over at the Treasury decided that they weren't going to do that. I felt a necessity to stick around long enough to make sure that happened, and it did. And then I felt I could gently step down and allow other people to carry on doing the work. As to what's happened since, I think that you can see in the NAO report that actually, I felt slightly exhausted when I read it with this sense of unrelenting responding to need. I think it's something that you asked at the beginning. Ideally, the department would have been in a position, but I don't think they were, to go for like big announcements over strategic periods of time are actually a lot easier to deal with than 10 million here and 10 million there. That's tough for colleagues in the department. It's very tough for colleagues in local government. But, I think Jeremy, as the Permanent Secretary outlined at the beginning, the department has been responding to the COVID-19 situation, and it would be hard to see how they wouldn't have been able to do that. But nobody should underestimate, however, the toll that will have taken both on colleagues in the department and, importantly, colleagues in local government and the charitable sector. But we'll get through it, and, at some point, God willing, this vaccination will help all of us and we can get back to normal.
Yeah, sorry, I did say it was the last one, but I'll just have a quick follow-up to that one. I particularly agree with your point about staff resilience and the people who are dealing on the front line here. Do you think the department's done enough to ensure that resilience is there? A lot of the people who are doing this work are on short-term contracts, don't have the certainty, and then if they contract COVID, are taken out of the situation when they self-isolate. Do you think the resilience is actually there to give the support people need?
Well, I mean, it's a huge question, really, about resilience in the public sector right now, not only across the National Health Service, but actually within some Whitehall departments at the same time as, colleagues that I know tonight are out doing street work to get people in during this freezing cold weather. We are lucky as a country that so many people will do lots of things and work incredibly hard, regardless of what they're paid or what rank they are. And if I was to single out, I've said this before publicly, Mr. Wilde, if I was going to single out one thing from the pandemic, for me, it would be both the public and the public sector have more than stood up to the mark and gone way beyond what anybody could have expected them to do.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I wonder maybe if Penny Hopman would want to add about that